There are castles, and then there is Neuschwanstein. It is an image so deeply embedded in our global consciousness that it feels less like a real place and more like a collective memory of a dream. It appears on postcards, in puzzle boxes, and on the screens of our childhoods. It is the archetype, the mold from which all our fairy tale fantasies are cast. Its slender, white towers do not command a strategic pass. They command the clouds, soaring with an almost arrogant disregard for the granite mountains they spring from. Its walls were never meant to repel an army. They were built to repel reality itself. It rises from a rugged hill in the Bavarian Alps, a fantasy of turrets, spires, and balconies, so impossibly perfect, so theatrically composed, that it feels like a grand opera that has solidified into stone. Millions of people make a pilgrimage to it every year, walking through its halls in a state of quiet awe. It is the direct inspiration for the Sleeping Beauty castle that sits at the heart of the Disney Kingdom, a symbol of magic and wonder recognized across the planet. It is, in every sense, the quintessential fairy tale castle. But this story is not a fairy tale. It is a tragedy. Every fairy tale has an author, a mind that conjures its enchanted forests and lonely towers. And the author of this one was no benevolent sorcerer or kindly king from a children's story. He was a real monarch, a man of flesh and blood, of profound passion and crippling sorrow, whose life was as strange, as complex, and as tragic as his creations were beautiful. This is the story of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, a man history has variously labeled the fairy tale king, the Swan King, and, most damningly, the Mad King. His life is one of the great enigmas of the 19th century, a story that blurs the lines between genius and insanity, between sublime artistic vision and ruinous obsession. He was a king who detested politics but adored pageantry, a ruler who fled his own court to build lonely, fantastical worlds for an audience of one. And his story ends as it was lived, in shadow, in mystery, and with a question that still echoes from the dark, cold waters of a Bavarian lake. Was King Ludwig II truly insane, a man whose mind had broken under the weight of a crown he never wanted and a world he could not comprehend? Or was he the victim of a cold and calculated royal conspiracy, a man systematically declared mad, deposed, and ultimately destroyed by enemies who used the nascent science of psychiatry as their most lethal weapon? To unravel this Mad King mystery, we must do more than just admire his castles. We must journey back in time, into the very heart of 19th century Bavarian history. We must enter a world caught between the lingering romance of the past and the brutal machinery of the modern age, a world of political intrigue, revolutionary art, and the magnificent, terrible power of a dream. This is not just the story of a man, but of an entire world on the cusp of irrevocable change, and of the one king who tried, with all his might, to build a fortress against the future. Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm was born on August 25, 1845, in the Nymphenburg Palace in Munich. His birth was a significant dynastic event. He was born into the ancient house of Wittelsbach, a dynasty that had ruled the duchy, electorate, and finally the Kingdom of Bavaria for over 700 years. The timing was auspicious. It was the feast day of Saint Louis IX of France, a Crusader king and his grandfather's namesake. From the very beginning, he was draped in the weight of history. But the world he was born into was not one of fairy tale romance. His childhood was a sterile and lonely affair, an environment of emotional permafrost. His father, Crown Prince Maximilian, who would soon become King Maximilian II, was a distant and scholarly man. Max, as he was known, was a constitutionalist, more interested in the abstract theories of governance and the study of history than in the flesh-and-blood reality of his own son. He was a good man, perhaps, but a cold father who saw his children primarily as dynastic obligations. His mother, Princess Marie of Prussia, was a woman known for her physical fortitude. She was an avid mountaineer, but not for her maternal warmth. She enforced a rigid, almost military schedule of lessons, exercise, and religious observance, believing that discipline, not affection, was the key to forging a prince. Ludwig and his younger brother, Otto, who was born 3 years later, grew up largely in the care of tutors and governesses. They saw their parents only at designated times, formal encounters drained of spontaneity or genuine connection. Their primary residence was not the Grand Palace in Munich, but the recently renovated Hohenschwangau Castle, a place that would become the crucible of Ludwig's imagination. Hohenschwangau, which means High Swan County, was itself a product of Maximilian's romantic historical interests. He had bought the ruin and rebuilt it in the Gothic Revival style. But this was no mere architectural folly. It was a canvas for the heroic myths of Germany's past. Imagine the young Ludwig, a shy, sensitive, and breathtakingly handsome boy, walking through these halls day after day. The walls were not bare. They were covered in vast, colorful murals depicting Teutonic legends. In one room, the story of the Swan Knight, Lohengrin, who arrives in a boat drawn by a swan to defend a maiden's honor. In another, the saga of Tannhauser, the knight torn between sacred and profane love. These were not just decorations. They were his primary companions, his first and most influential teachers. He absorbed these tales of chivalry, honor, tragic love, and mystical quests as other children absorb nursery rhymes. For him, this world of legend was more real, more vibrant, and infinitely more appealing than the stiff, formal world of the 19th century court. He would spend hours in solitary play, dressing up as these knights, acting out their dramas, his mind already building worlds far from the one he was forced to inhabit. This intense interior life was a refuge, but it also set him apart. He was painfully shy and socially awkward, prone to sudden, daydreaming reveries from which he was difficult to rouse. He had few friends, preferring the company of his horses or the solitude of the alpine forests. This was seen by his tutors and his father as a character flaw, a sign of weakness that needed to be corrected with even stricter discipline, which of course only drove him further inward. The only person with whom he shared a real bond was his younger brother, Otto. But this relationship was also touched by tragedy. Otto, too, was a sensitive soul, and as they grew older, it became clear that he suffered from a serious mental illness, which would eventually lead to his own lifelong seclusion. The Wittelsbach line had a history of eccentricity and mental instability, a dark thread running through their storied lineage. It was a genetic shadow that would hang over both brothers for their entire lives. In 1861, at the age of 15, Ludwig experienced an event that would ignite the kindling of his imagination into a lifelong fire. He was taken to the opera in Munich to see a performance of Richard Wagner's Lohengrin. It was a seismic event in his young life. Here, on the stage, was the very story from his bedroom walls, brought to life with music of such overwhelming power and emotional intensity that it struck him with the force of a religious conversion. From that moment on, Richard Wagner was not just a composer to Ludwig, he was a god, an oracle, the high priest of a new, transcendent art form. Ludwig began to devour everything Wagner had written, not just his music, but his essays on art, culture, and myth. He saw in Wagner the promise of a German cultural rebirth, a new golden age where art, not politics, would lead the way. It was an obsession that would define his reign, shape his destiny, and ultimately, contribute to his ruin. On March 10, 1864, the world of daydreams came to a sudden, brutal end. King Maximilian II died after a short illness. And Ludwig, at the tender age of 18, a boy with no training in statecraft and no interest in governance, was proclaimed King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He was, by all accounts, terrified. He reportedly wept to his aide. "I have become king much too early." The people of Bavaria, however, were captivated. They saw their new monarch, a young man of almost supernatural beauty, tall, dark-haired, with piercing blue eyes, and they were enchanted. He looked like the Swan Knight from the legends had stepped right off the stage and onto the throne. But the government ministers in the capital, Munich, were not so easily charmed. They saw an awkward, inexperienced boy, lost in his own world, and they prepared to manage him. Ludwig's very first act as king was a startling indication of his priorities, a move that sent shockwaves through the conservative court. He dispatched his cabinet secretary with a mission of the utmost urgency to find Richard Wagner and bring him to Munich. At this point in his life, Richard Wagner was a pariah. He was 51 years old, a known political revolutionary who had been exiled from Germany for his role in the 1849 Dresden Uprising. He was a notorious debtor, constantly on the run from his creditors. He was a musical radical whose complex, dissonant works were mocked by the establishment. And he was a man known for his colossal ego, his manipulative personality, and his deeply unpleasant anti-Semitic writings. Ludwig saw none of this. He saw only his hero, the creator of the worlds he so loved. When Wagner arrived in Munich, the meeting was electric. The aging, beleaguered composer was stunned to find not just a royal patron, but a disciple, a young king who knew his work intimately and spoke his own artistic language. For Ludwig, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. He wrote ecstatically, "Today I was brought to him he is, alas, the so beautifully divine friend who brings to my soul the only possible balm and cure." The king immediately paid off all of Wagner's immense debts. He gave him a lavish apartment and a generous stipend. Most importantly, he commissioned Wagner to complete his magnum opus, the monumental four-opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung. For Ludwig, this was not an indulgence. It was the sacred duty of a king to foster the highest art, to create a new Athens in his own capital. For the Bavarian government and the public, however, it was a scandal. They saw their young, impressionable king being manipulated by a notorious charlatan. They saw huge sums of state money being lavished on a foreigner, a radical, while the king neglected his actual duties. The press began a vicious campaign against Wagner, portraying him as a greedy leech and a dangerous influence. The relationship between king and composer, while artistically fertile, was a political disaster. Ludwig's true passion, a grand plan he shared with Wagner, was to build a magnificent new festival theater on the banks of the Isar River in Munich. It would be a temple dedicated to the perfect performance of Wagner's operas, a German Bayreuth. But his ministers, seeing the exorbitant cost and horrified by Wagner's meddling in political appointments, blocked the project at every turn. The resistance was so fierce that, in 1865, Ludwig was forced to ask his idol to leave Bavaria to quell the public outcry. It was a deep personal blow, but his patronage continued from afar, a torrent of letters and funds flowing from Munich to wherever Wagner was living. The true death knell for Ludwig's political ambitions came in 1866. The great struggle for dominance in the German-speaking world erupted into open conflict, the Austro-Prussian War. Bavaria, a Catholic kingdom with historic ties to Austria, reluctantly sided with the Austrian Empire. Ludwig, who loathed war and all things military, was compelled by his ministers to sign the Order of Mobilization. The result was a swift and humiliating catastrophe. The ruthlessly efficient, modern Prussian army, armed with needle guns and commanded by brilliant strategists, crushed the Austrians and their allies in a matter of weeks. For Ludwig, the defeat was the ultimate disillusionment. Bavaria was forced to pay a massive indemnity and sign a secret treaty that placed its army under Prussian command in the event of a future conflict. His kingdom, which he had dreamed of turning into a beacon of art and culture, was now little more than a satellite state of the militaristic, Protestant North. He had learned a bitter lesson. He was politically powerless. He was a constitutional monarch, a figurehead whose real authority was constrained by his parliament and now completely overshadowed by the rising might of Prussia and its formidable chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. This political castration was the pivotal moment in Ludwig's life, the point at which he made a conscious decision to turn his back on the world. If he could not be a true, sovereign king in reality, then he would become an absolute monarch in a kingdom of his own creation. If the world would not allow him to build his temple to art in Munich, he would build it in the mountains, far from the petty intrigues of politicians. He began a systematic withdrawal from public life. He abandoned Munich for long stretches, retreating to the remote alpine wilderness he had loved as a child. He began to reverse night and day, sleeping for much of the day and coming alive at night. He would go on long, solitary sleigh rides through the moonlit, snow-covered forests, his ornate, gilded sleighs attended by servants in 18th-century livery. He was constructing a private theater around himself, and he was both the sole actor and the sole audience. And it was here, in this self-imposed exile, that he began to build. His first and most famous architectural fantasy was Neuschwanstein Castle. He chose a spectacular, perilous site, the location of two small, ruined medieval castles on a rugged spur of rock overlooking the Pollock Gorge and the vast plains below. The very act of building there was an act of defiance against nature and engineering. He wrote to Wagner, describing his vision. The location is one of the most beautiful to be found, holy and unapproachable, a worthy temple for the divine friend who has brought salvation and true blessing to the world. Neuschwanstein was never intended as a royal residence in any practical sense. It was conceived as an inhabitable stage set, a romantic, idealized reconstruction of a medieval knight's castle, drawn directly from the imagery of Wagner's operas. Every detail was a tribute to a myth. To enter Neuschwanstein is to walk through Ludwig's mind. The vast, two-story Singers' Hall is a breathtaking homage to the one at the historic Wartburg Castle, site of the legendary song contest featured in Tannhauser. The walls are covered in frescoes depicting the story of Parsifal and his quest for the Holy Grail. The king's own study features the story of Tannhauser. His bedroom is a marvel of Gothic woodwork, with intricate carvings that took 14 carpenters over 4 years to complete, its walls depicting the tragic love story of Tristan and Isolde. Perhaps the most astonishing room is the throne room. It is not a room, but a cavernous, two-story chapel of Byzantine design, a vision of shimmering gold and deep blue lapis lazuli. The floor is a mosaic of over 2 million stones, depicting the flora and fauna of the world. A massive, gilded chandelier shaped like a Byzantine crown hangs from the heavens. The entire space was designed to evoke the legendary Grail Hall, the holiest of sites in his personal mythology. But it contained no throne. By the time the room was nearing completion, Ludwig had been deposed. The gilded dais, where his throne was meant to stand, remains empty to this day, a poignant, silent symbol of his lost kingdom. Building Neuschwanstein was a monumental and fantastically expensive undertaking. Ludwig poured his personal fortune into it, and when that ran out, he began to borrow heavily, not from the state, but from the royal houses of Europe. It is crucial to remember that he was also a modernizer in his own fantasy world. The castle, for all its medieval appearance, was equipped with the latest technology, a form of central heating, running water on all floors, flush toilets, and even a telephone line connecting his apartments to the servants' quarters. But Neuschwanstein was only the beginning. As his debts mounted, his architectural ambitions only grew. He turned his attention to Lindenhof Palace, a small but exquisitely ornate jewel box of a palace nestled in a remote valley. If Neuschwanstein was a tribute to German Romanticism, Lindenhof was an homage to French absolutism. It was built in a Rococo style, a glittering fantasy of mirrors, cherubs, and gold leaf. It was a tribute to the French Bourbon kings, particularly Louis XIV and Louis XV, whom Ludwig idolized as true, absolute monarchs who had successfully fused political power with artistic glory. Lindenhof was his most personal retreat, and it is here that his behavior began to seem truly eccentric to the outside world. He commissioned a magic table, just like the one in the Grimm's fairy tale, which could be lowered through the floor to the kitchens below and reappear, fully set for a meal. This allowed him to dine without the presence of servants, preserving his treasured solitude. He often dined alone, but would have places set for the ghosts of French royalty, like Louis XIV or Marie Antoinette, with whom he would hold long, imaginary conversations. His most famous and fantastical creation at Lindenhof was the Venus Grotto. This was a massive, artificial cave, blasted out of the mountainside. Inside, He constructed a subterranean lake, a waterfall, and a stage area painted with scenes from Wagner's Tannhauser. Using an early electrical generator supplied by the Siemens Company, he could illuminate the grotto in shifting colors of red, blue, and green, a pioneering use of theatrical lighting. Here, he would be rowed across the water in a gilded, seashell-shaped boat, listening to musicians play excerpts from Wagner, imagining himself as the knight Tannhauser in the magical, subterranean realm of the goddess of love. It was an act of pure, unadulterated fantasy, brought to life with cutting-edge technology and limitless expense. His final and most grandiose project was Herrenchiemsee, built on an island in the middle of Bavaria's largest lake, the Chiemsee. This was not a castle, but a palace, intended to be a replica of the Palace of Versailles. It was an act of pure, obsessive homage to his ultimate royal hero, Louis XIV, the Sun King. Herrenchiemsee was an act of breathtaking, almost insane ambition. Its magnificent hall of mirrors is actually larger and more ornate than the original at Versailles. Its rooms are filled with an almost overwhelming opulence of gold leaf, Meissen porcelain, and crystal chandeliers. The grand staircase is a faithful replica of the ambassador's staircase at Versailles, which had already been destroyed in France, meaning Ludwig was rebuilding a lost world from drawings alone. The state bedroom, where he never slept, features a bed that took 7 craftsmen 7 years to carve. The palace was a monument to an ideal of absolute monarchy that was utterly at odds with the political reality of his time. It was also a monument to his profound loneliness. It was a palace designed for a court of thousands, yet he only ever spent a handful of nights there, completely alone, wandering its vast, empty, glittering halls by candlelight. So much of the palace was left unfinished, a testament to a dream that was simply too big, even for a king. These projects were financially catastrophic. By the mid-1880s, King Ludwig II was over 14 million marks in debt, an astronomical sum, equivalent to tens, if not hundreds, of millions of dollars today. It is important to reiterate that this was his private debt, not a state debt. He had not stolen from the treasury. But his debts were so large that his creditors, many of them powerful European banking families, were threatening to seize royal property. This, his government ministers argued, would be a national humiliation that would destabilize the entire Bavarian state. The government in Munich, led by the pragmatic and ambitious Prime Minister Johann von Lutz, had reached its breaking point. For years, they had tolerated their reclusive, eccentric king as a harmless, if expensive, oddity. But now, his debts provided them with a perfect opportunity. They had a king who refused to govern, who was threatening the financial stability of the kingdom, and whose bizarre, nocturnal lifestyle was becoming the subject of lurid gossip all over Europe. They decided he had to be removed. But how do you depose the king? You cannot simply fire him. According to the Bavarian constitution, the only way was to prove him medically unfit to rule. And the chosen weapon was psychiatry. The conspiracy began to take shape. Lutz and his allies secretly began to compile a dossier of the king's symptoms. They gathered sworn testimony from a host of disgruntled servants, estranged court officials, and spies they had placed in his household. The list of accusations was long and damning, a curated collection of every eccentricity and rumor. It spoke of his violent rages, often directed at his staff over trivial matters. It detailed his crippling shyness, which had morphed into a genuine social phobia. It described his imaginary conversations with historical figures, his strange nocturnal habits, and his obsession with building projects that seemed to have no rational purpose. It also hinted at his homosexuality, which, while not a medical symptom, was a source of deep personal torment for the devoutly Catholic king, and a potential scandal the government could exploit. This carefully constructed dossier was handed to a panel of 4 eminent psychiatrists, led by the most respected nerve doctor in Bavaria, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. And here we come to the most controversial, most damning part of the entire affair, the very core of the Mad King mystery. Dr. von Gudden and his colleagues, without ever once meeting, speaking to, or personally examining King Ludwig II, produced a medical report, the Arsliches Gutachten. In this report, they diagnosed the king, from a distance, with paranoia and declared him mentally incapable of governing. In modern medical and legal terms, such a remote diagnosis would be laughed out of any courtroom. It is a gross violation of every ethical principle. But in 1886, in the hands of powerful men with the political agenda, it was a death warrant. It was the scientific justification they needed to stage a coup d'état. Armed with this document, the conspirators moved. On the night of June 9, 1886, a government commission, led by Baron von Hohenstein, a man Ludwig had once considered a friend, traveled to Neuschwanstein Castle, the king's beloved fairy tale sanctuary. Their mission: to inform the king that he was deposed and that his uncle, Luitpold, would now serve as Prince Regent. The first attempt to capture the king failed spectacularly. Ludwig was tipped off, possibly by his loyal coachman. When the commissioners arrived, they found the castle gates barred. The local peasants and villagers, who were fiercely loyal to the king who had brought so much work and money to their poor alpine region, were alerted. They surrounded the castle, armed with pitchforks and scythes. The local police, loyal to their king rather than the distant government, actually arrested the commissioners and threw them in the castle jail. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Ludwig might rally support, fight back, and expose the conspiracy. He sent telegrams to other European leaders, including Bismarck, pleading for help. But the replies were slow to come, or non-existent. Ludwig was isolated, indecisive, and perhaps, in the end, too much of a dreamer to be a political fighter. He hesitated, and in his hesitation, he was lost. 2 days later, in the early hours of June 12th, a second commission arrived, this time with more force and better planning. They stormed the castle and took the king into custody. He offered no resistance. He was a broken man. As he was led away from his unfinished masterpiece, the monument to his life's dream, he is said to have remarked to a loyal servant, "Treat my castle with care. It is my only joy." He was transported by carriage to Berg Castle, a small, unremarkable manor house on the shore of Lake Starnberg, just south of Munich. This was to be his prison. And his jailer, the man in charge of his medical care, was to be the very man who had engineered his downfall, Dr. von Gudden. And here, the story takes its final, dark, and impenetrably mysterious turn. The next day, June 13th, was Whitsunday. The weather was foul, rainy, windy, and overcast. Ludwig seemed calm, resigned to his fate. He had lunch with Dr. von Gudden and the other doctors. Around 6:30 in the evening, as the rain let up slightly, Ludwig asked to go for a walk along the shore of the lake. Dr. von Gudden agreed to accompany him. The king was a large, powerful man, still physically imposing at 40 years old, and Gudden was in his 60s. 2 attendants, or keepers, were ordered to follow them at a discreet distance. However, in a strange and fateful decision that has never been adequately explained, Dr. Gudden turned to the attendants and ordered them not to follow. He and the king, he said, would be fine on their own and would be back by 8 p.m. They walked off together down a path towards the lake, 2 figures receding into the gray evening gloom. They never returned. 8 o'clock came and went. The rain started again. There was no sign of the king or the doctor. Panic began to set in at the castle. A search was organized. Servants, guards, and local fishermen fanned out across the castle grounds and along the lakeshore, their way lit by flickering torches that cast dancing, monstrous shadows. For hours, they found nothing but the wind and the rain. Around 11:30 p.m., the search party made a horrifying discovery. In the shallow water of the lake, only a few feet from the bank, they found the bodies of both King Ludwig II and Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. The doctor's body was found first, and then the king's, floating face down, his arms outstretched, a few yards further out. The official story was announced almost immediately, as if prepared in advance. King Ludwig II, in a final paroxysm of madness, had decided to commit suicide by drowning himself in the lake. The brave Dr. von Gudden had attempted to stop him, and in the ensuing struggle had also been tragically drowned by the powerful, insane king. The case was closed. A tragic but tidy end to the reign of the Mad King. But the official story is not a story. It is a sieve, full of holes. So many holes that it has fueled over a century of deep suspicion and given rise to a powerful and persistent royal conspiracy theory. Let us examine the evidence. First, the method of death. Ludwig was an exceptionally strong swimmer. The water where his body was found was only knee-deep. It seems an incredibly unlikely place for an experienced swimmer to accidentally or intentionally drown. He could have simply stood up. Second, the autopsies. The autopsy of Dr. von Gudden revealed signs of a violent struggle. He had been strangled and had suffered significant blows to the head and face. This suggests he was not just a passive victim of a drowning, he was attacked. This part fits the official narrative of a struggle. However, the autopsy of King Ludwig is where the story unravels. The official report, signed by Dr. Gudden's own colleagues, stated that no water was found in the king's lungs. While it is medically possible to drown without inhaling water in rare cases of laryngospasm or dry drowning, it is highly unusual. The most common cause of death was listed as asphyxiation by drowning. It was a convenient, if not entirely convincing, conclusion. Third, the witness testimony. For over a century, stories have persisted, passed down through local families. The fisherman, Jacob Little, who was part of the search party, maintained for his entire life that there were signs of a struggle not just in the water, but on the bank. He claimed the king's umbrella and overcoat were found discarded far from the water's edge. Most sensationally, several people, including a baroness who lived nearby, claimed to have heard 2 gunshots ring out across the lake that evening. Fourth, the physical evidence. One of the king's most loyal attendants, a woman named Zanders, later swore on her deathbed that the overcoat the king was wearing, when it was brought back to the castle that night, had 2 clear bullet holes in the back. The coat subsequently vanished. The official autopsy report, of course, makes no mention of any gunshot wounds. Was the report falsified? Was there a cover-up? The conspiracy theory posits a very different and much darker scenario for that rainy Sunday evening. It suggests that Ludwig, far from being suicidal, was trying to escape. Perhaps he had made contact with loyalists, the local fishermen, his devoted cousin Empress Elizabeth Cece of Austria, who were to meet him with a boat on the other side of the lake. Dr. Gudden discovered the plan and tried to stop him. A struggle ensued on the bank, and Ludwig, a strong and desperate man, killed the doctor. But then, before Ludwig could make his escape into the water, assassins, hired by the government in Munich to silence him permanently, emerged from the shadows. They shot him, perhaps twice, and then dragged both bodies into the shallow water to stage the scene as a murder-suicide by drowning. Who had the most to gain? The government, now free of their inconvenient king. Prince Regent Luitpold, now secure in his power. And what of Ludwig's brother, Otto? He was officially proclaimed king, but he too was immediately declared insane and kept in seclusion for the rest of his life, never ruling for a single day. The regency of Luitpold continued for another 26 years, solidifying the power of the conspirators for a generation. We will likely never know the truth for certain. The Wittelsbach family has repeatedly refused requests to have the king's remains exhumed for a modern forensic examination that could easily detect bullet wounds or other trauma. The secret archives related to his death remain sealed. The mystery is preserved, locked away just as surely as Ludwig was in his final hours at Berg Castle. What, then, is the legacy of this strange and tragic king? In his lifetime, he was seen by the powerful men who ran his country as an abject failure. An irresponsible, eccentric, possibly mad monarch who shirked his duties, wasted his fortune, and brought shame upon his kingdom. But history has a funny, ironic way of judging. The castles he built, those extravagant follies that were used as the primary evidence of his insanity, have become the enduring symbol of Bavaria. They are the engine of a massive tourism industry and have repaid the king's private debts hundreds, if not thousands, of times over. The Mad King's private dream has become his country's most valuable public asset. His patronage of Wagner, seen as a ruinous indulgence, fundamentally changed the course of Western music and opera. We are left with the ghost of a king and his enduring question. Was King Ludwig II a misunderstood romantic genius, a poet trapped on a throne, who chose to build sublime beauty as a shield against a world he found ugly and brutal? Or was he a deeply troubled man, retreating from a reality he could not handle, whose magnificent obsessions were merely the symptoms of a mind in fatal decline? Perhaps, in the end, the two are not mutually exclusive. Perhaps he was a man whose very genius was inseparable from his madness, and whose fairy tale dreams, in the end, led him to a very real and very dark nightmare. The final truth, like the king himself, lies silent, just beneath the surface of the water. Thank you for listening. What is your theory on this enduring Mad King mystery? Was it a tragic suicide, a desperate escape attempt gone wrong, or a cold-blooded political assassination? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. If you find these explorations of history's great enigmas compelling, please consider subscribing and sharing the story. Your support allows us to continue our journey into the shadows of the past. Until next time, sleep well.